Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the inclusion conversation with our wonderful, lovely, talented, inspiring friend, Astrid Castro, who is the founder and the CEO of Adoption Mosaic. Welcome, Astrid. We're really pleased to have you here today.
Hello, thank you so much. We've been looking forward to, you and I have been planning this for a while and looking forward to this for, yeah, ever since. So thank you for having me.
We're really excited that you could join us and be here and just talk with us about just your journey and your experience and the inspiring organization that you've built.
Mm.
And you and I met, oh gosh, I think almost a year ago now.
Mhm.
Time flies. And I just remember feeling so safe with you, but also just in kindred spirit with you in terms of how we are trying to elevate, right, our communities to center us,
Mhm.
center our
Mhm.
lived experience, to reclaim our narratives, and also provide, right, resources and the necessary education for all those around us who want to be our allies and our supporters, and how to make our experience better in the adoptee space. So I'm really excited to chat with you today, be able to dive into your story a little bit more. So, with that in mind, I would love for you to share with us a little bit about your journey on and how you got to become the founder and the CEO of Adoption Mosaic, but even before that, um, how you came to be an adoptee.
How I came to be an adoptee. So when I was about 4.5 and my sister was 6, my full biological sister, we were living in Colombia with our mother, and we were then the story that we grew up being told, the narrative, the rainbows and unicorns narrative of our story was that our mother probably, my parents did say that they used words like, we don't know, maybe, possibly, probably this happened. So I do appreciate that they planted those words in our narrative. And so basically they just said it's, very possible your mother just didn't have the ability to care for 2 children and that she was poor. And maybe, and Mia, my sister, had memories of us living on the streets. So that was part of our narrative. And just nobody knew. We were just available for adoption. And so my parents here stateside were not able to have children biologically, so they decided to go through the process of adopting, and they went through an agency that had connections with Colombia,
Mm,
and my parents, this was in 1975, and my parents had never traveled or been to Colombia, did not speak Spanish. And they said yes to adopting a 4.5 and 6-year-old, thinking they were adopting a 3 and 4-year-old. And so we arrived only speaking Spanish. The only other person I had in my life that I could communicate with for those first months was my sister until we were assimilated into the English speaking family. And
mhm.
then we learned English and completely lost our Spanish in 6 months. The social workers had said, well, they're going to hold on to their language a little bit longer because they're together, as if that was a bad thing.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so within 6 months, had lost our Spanish, only spoke English, and we were on our, path to becoming our parents, in a sense, clean slate adoption, right? Treat them as if you gave birth to them, love will conquer all. Uh,
Mm,
and, um, and that, yeah, like so many of us transracial adoptees, we were a conspicuous family. So we stuck out like a sore thumb. My sister and I we moved a lot growing up and were raised in predominantly white spaces, well, exclusively white spaces, but we moved around a lot. So mostly East Coast, but Atlanta, Wayland, Massachusetts, Maine, Portland, Maine, back to Massachusetts,
Oh my
and then
goodness.
out to Colorado. Yeah, a lot of places. And you know, moving when you're a transracial family really means you have to redefine yourself, and the racism that when I hear that kids say, "Oh, I grew up in one town, the town it was a small town, and the town kind of got used to our family dynamic, and I didn't get a lot of you know, racial at the, you know, maybe when I was younger, but it kind of like at some point in their life they were like, yeah, the community knew we were a family, we didn't have to explain ourselves all the time. And for my sister and I, we, because we moved around so often, we were explaining, I grew up explaining or sharing or telling my adoption narrative constantly to new people, constantly, teachers and friends and other parents, parents of other friends, and so forth. Um, so we were on display a lot, having
Mm.
to talk about our adoption a lot, which I actually think that probably that has something to do with the work that I do today, is being comfortable talking about my adoption, and so
Yeah,
that.
that's really poignant when you said we were on display a lot. Like that really, I think, resonates with a lot of folks in our community. It really resonates with me because being in predominantly white spaces, it's such an obvious contrast, right? But then you're kind of pushed out and just center stage saying, look at me, I'm the poster child of adoption. And that's just so poignant how you put that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's also getting, not just being put on display, but also uh, existing in a space where we are told constantly when we're on display and telling our story. We heard a lot, and I don't know if it's more because we were moving around so often and we had to start over and redefining our family in every move that we did, that I feel that we also then were bombarded with the narrative of you're so lucky, you're so lucky, you're so lucky.
Mm,
Right. And so that became something that was part of our narrative. And to kind of go push against that or lean into that was something that was something I was comfortable doing as an adult. So when I got to 18 years old, or, you know, in the ages of kind of, I'm moving on, I'm doing my own thing, and I'm going to talk about adoption the way I want to talk about it. I was the person when somebody said, "Oh, you're so lucky," and I would literally just say to anybody who would say that, "So let me tell you my story, and you just stop me where luck is supposed to start," right? And I would start with, we were possibly living on the streets. We lost our mother, you know, just listing off all of these very traumatic things that had happened
mm-hmm.
to us. And I got, you know, a lot of people being like, "Oh, well, you're ungrateful." And I also got a lot of people thanking me for putting that into perspective at a really young age, because I was really vocal and verbal about how mad I was about adoption. And once I was 18, I was mad about other things when I was younger, and I didn't realize they were correlated to adoption. But I was a I was frustrated in life. Nothing was designed or built for me. And so in my adolescence, I was frustrated. And then when I was young adulthood, that transitions to, oh, there's this thing, adoption, that I actually am going to build some language around so I can tell my community I'm frustrated about that. Because I had learned how to be verbal and communicate my frustration towards being dyslexic. So I didn't learn to read
Mm,
until I was 14. And so I learned the language around how to talk about, I'm not a strong reader. I don't read. I need books on tape. I need tutors. I need, in order to go to school, these are the things that I need. And I got really good at that in my high school years, my last 4 years, because that was the only way that I was going to graduate knowing how to read.
Wow, that's super powerful and impactful, and like such a parallel too for like the language shift and the mindset set shift that would prepare you, right, for being able to enter into this space of how we change the narrative about how adoption is spoken about, especially from our lived experience. So that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. Hmm.
So, talk a little bit about, I guess this shift at 18 years old, and it would be interesting to hear just like I guess the dynamic with your family, if you talked about adoption inside your family, if that was ever addressed, if that was ignored. There's such a range of experiences within these families, but it would be interesting to hear what that was like, and then how that impacted you when you turned 18 and then started to make your own way into the world.
Yeah, so I didn't really talk about adoption a whole lot. So a lot of people say, "Oh, it's so wonderful you were adopted with your sister." Which, yes, it is wonderful that I was adopted with my biological sister and that we weren't separated. And what followed that is at least you had somebody, and then fill in the blank, right? At least you had somebody too, and that looked like you. Okay, well, that's one person out of my entire community. So, but that seems to have checked that box of at least you're not isolated. No, 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 no. Now there's two people who are isolated. We're still
Hmm.
isolated.
Yeah.
And at least you had somebody to talk to. Well, that's completely untrue, because in the same way, if you don't teach somebody the language of something, they don't know how to talk about it. So if, my family doesn't teach me French, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, at least the two of you had each other to speak French to. Well, no, neither one of us spoke French. Like, that doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense. So we didn't grow up with the narrative of adoption in our family talking about it. We had the narrative of, if you ever want to talk about this thing, I'm always here for you. But this thing was never given language, which was adoption
Mm.
or race or these other things. And so when it was presented, I do actually want to talk about this. It was, oh, that's interesting. I'm sorry. Or just there was empathy. There was, but we don't know. It was just, we don't know. Do you think our mother wanted us? My parents didn't have the language to say, let's talk more about that. Let's dive into that. It sounds like you're having a lot of feelings. It sounds like, and drawing that out. Instead, it was, we don't know anything, so then why would I continue to ask? So when I was
Hmm.
18, I was professionally snowboarding at the time, and I went to I was living in Denver, and Breckenridge in the winter and Denver in the summers. And in Denver, I had, during the dry land training and the kind of summer off race months, I had some extra time to volunteer. I grew up with a family that did a lot of community support and a lot of volunteering. And I decided that I was going to try to find an organization, an adoption agency at that time at 18, that I wanted to go and volunteer for, and during some of my hours as that I had off. So I found an organization, that's a long story, but I found an organization that didn't actually, they weren't a placement agency. They were, was one of the exchanges. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Rocky Mountain Adoption
Yes.
Exchange. The exchanges, there's, well, I don't know how many there are, but at that time there were 3 in the
There's
country.
quite a,
Then
yeah.
there's now, yeah, there's quite a few. So the exchange specialized in children who were in foster care and help, and these were children that were at risk of aging out of foster care for whatever reason. And so they specialized in recruitment for families for those specific children. So I then volunteered for them. And that is the first place that I professionally started talking about my story and adoption, and had an audience and had a platform. I was given a
Wow.
platform to talk about it. And the exchange, the executive director, Dixie Davis, who is no longer alive, was such an incredible mentor to me. She wasn't an adoptive parent, she wasn't an adoptee, and she was somebody who just would sit there and just listen to our adoptee voices. And I would watch her listen to other adoptees and just say, I am here to listen and learn from you. And she was probably one of the first non-adoptees that I knew who was literally uplifting the adoptee community, kind of one adoptee at a time. So
Wow.
she gave me a lot of space.
She was your first model. She
Hmm.
was your
Hmm.
first model of centering your lived experience.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and she centered it beautifully. She gave me, I presented on a panel. I was the only adoptee on a panel for prospective adoptive people interested in adoption, and so I started presenting to that group. And every month I would go to their monthly prepare or waiting families. I would go to that and share my experience. And then one day, I want to say maybe 2 months into it, I my dad was asked me where I was going, and I said, oh, I'm going to go be on this panel. And he was like, oh, that's cool. And I think he was dropping me off or something, I don't remember. And I was like, do you want to come in? And he said, sure. I don't care, that sounds good and fun, whatever. And he came in, and then somebody had said, oh, that would be so fascinating to have the two of you on the panel together. And I thought, okay, all right, let's do
Hmm.
this. I'm not going to filter what I have to say, and I'm kind of right now not super excited about this whole being adopted thing. So yeah, bring it on. Let's see what happens. So dad gets on the panel, and we go back and forth from our different perspectives. And then, at one, and I used and still do used humor. That at that time, that was humor that was in some ways um covering up the heavy emotion pieces of things, right? And so anyway, my father is a pretty funny person. And somebody in the audience said, you know to ask me, has it been hard to not look like your parents? And I pointed to my dad, and I was like, do you think I want to look like him? And everybody laughed and thought that was funny, and my dad thought that was really funny. So my parents had their own way to hold space for me to talk about it, but I had to be the one who educated them about the language and about how to talk about it. They didn't educate me.
Wow. And how old were you at this time?
I was 18.
Wow.
Yeah.
It just, I'm really moved and just really appreciate at 18 how much wisdom you had at that age to uh, be authentic to yourself,
Mhm.
right? You weren't afraid to share what your lived experience was. You weren't going to sugarcoat it or pour honey on it so that it sounded better especially with your adopted dad in the room. Like that's amazing. I don't know at 18 that I would have had the fortitude to do that.
And I don't know, Grace, I don't know that it was wisdom. I think it was anger.
Mm,
I think that at that point, I had spent until 14 living in a academic world, in a world that where you had to be a reader, in a world where you had to you do well in school, in a world that if you didn't have that, you were considered a bad kid, right? I was good at sports. I was good at getting my teachers to pass me to the next grade. I was good at becoming friends with my teachers. I was good at that interpersonal. I was really good at reading people's body language and their eye contact. And like those were the things
mm,
that kept me going. Right. And so that, I think, being that stuck in a structure that was not designed for me made me have to survive in a way in this academic world in a way that had to be outside the box. And so, yeah, I feel like wisdom, I would be comfortable using the word wisdom now. But
Yeah.
then I don't think that was wisdom. It wasn't conscious. I was pissed off.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yes.
I let the world know around me when I was. And so yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
Mm,
we're getting some uh comments from the audience that kind of echo those sentiments. But I mean, yes, I think reflecting now, right? You did have wisdom at that age. It was just being expressed out of anger.
okay.
That was your driving force.
Hmm,
That's
hmm.
how, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's incredible. I think it's
Mm,
incredible. And that you had just like the internal drive to like stand up for yourself like that. At 18, I hadn't learned that yet either.
mm,
So that's really wonderful and amazing. So it's also, right, it's frustrating, right, that we have to go through these experiences to be able to like, right, produce results like that. We are the ones that have to climb those hills and fight those battles.
yeah.
And yeah, I'm sorry you went through that your entire
Mm,
life.
mm,
And I see it, but I also really deeply appreciate what that did for our communities as you found your voice even more, as you traveled your career journey and then ended up building Adoption Mosaic.
mm,
So you've been founder and leader of Adoption Mosaic for like 20 years now.
mhm,
What a
mhm,
legacy. That's amazing. That's
mm,
incredible. And I know there's been a lot of bumps in the road. There's been highs and lows and everything in between. But you have been so steadfast in your commitment, in your drive to just making life, experiences, support, resources better for those with lived experience and all of those folks that want to support adoptees. And so would love to hear a little bit about, after that kind of experience with your mentor, who really was your first model
mm,
of how to center you in
mhm,
the
mhm.
adoption story. How did that kind of influence and shape and propel you into building Adoption Mosaic?
Yes, that's a great question. I think it was my that her as my mentor, and I also want to say I think it was also a big part of it was my parents, and because I realized at a really young age, at 18, that I could push back. I could start having say hard things that were around adoption and my parents weren't going anywhere. Right. Or my dad laughing at me, being like, I don't want to look like this guy. Like, thank goodness I was, didn't grow up having to look like that. Throwing him using humor and him laughing at that. And I mean, not to say that all the conversations were easy, and my parents, they had no idea what was coming down the road when it came to, I'm needing to have some really hard conversations and I need you to come to the table. But that was kind of that first. So it was my mentor and my parents saying, we're not going anywhere. They didn't go anywhere with my dyslexia, and my mom really fought for me. My mom is the reason I know how to read to this
Wow.
day. I probably would have graduated high school without knowing how to read. And so, um,
Wow.
yeah, uh, so kind of going in that, just there were little baby steps that was like these aha moments that I realized there's a lot of people out there who don't know how to talk about adoption, and watching these adoptive parents doing the exact same thing that my parents had done with me and my sister, and not creating space, not talking about race, not talking about adoption, not talking about grief and loss and separation, and questioning the industry of adoption that
Mm-hmm.
that I needed to have those conversations at a really young age. And I say really young. I mean, I think that if it hadn't been for my learning disability, I think I probably would have needed or wanted to have those conversations earlier, a lot earlier. But I was so focused on not being a reader that these things were delayed, and that these things then ended up happening from when I was 18 to about 24, 23. Um, where I was really pushing back hard on my parents around why they like it dawned on me, wait a second, you guys never even went to Colombia. One day my mom's when I said,
Mhm.
why did you pick Colombia? And she said, oh, it's such a beautiful country and the people are so wonderful and so beautiful. And she's trying to uplift me and make me feel good about where I come from. But then as an adult, I'm like, wait a second, I met you at the Logan International Airport in Boston. Like, you have never been back there. Like,
Yeah.
what? And how is that an ethical adoption? How is that not speaking Spanish? And anyway, so all of these things. So led me to building Adoption Mosaic. I after snowboarding, I retired at the ripe old age of 22 years old from snowboarding. And like I was an old lady by then. And so I had continued working at the the exchange, Rocky Mountain Adoption Exchange. I moved to Italy. That's a long story, but I moved to Italy. And while I was in Italy, the exchange had a program to go into military bases in Italy. Well, that's the one that I went to, but there were a couple of military bases in Europe, and I went to the one in Italy, northern Italy, and talked to the families about the possibility of them becoming foster to adopt parents. And that there
Okay.
was a new program that was allowing overseas families that were serving and in the U.S. military, that they were eligible now, which prior to this time, they were not eligible to adopt. They moved too much. They were out of state, and so to finalize an adoption was nearly impossible. So I then worked for the exchange and went to the military bases and educated families about, or couples. They were all couples. There were no single individuals, but they were all couples, and educating them about, here's the process, here's what you do, here's who you talk to, da 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 da. So I did that, and then we moved to the States. And when we moved to the States, my mentor, the same mentor at the exchange, said, Astrid, you're going to go do some great things, but you have to go get your education. You have your high school diploma, but nobody's going to take you serious. The rhetoric that I've heard my
Yeah.
entire life, nobody's going to take you serious if you don't have a degree. And I see you going places. And I remember being like, God damn it. Like no, I don't know. I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm going to push against this system, and I'm going to prove that you don't have to have a college education to do this. But I'll take some classes on the side while I'm thinking about how I prove to the world I don't need to go to college,
Yep.
right? And
That
and I
balancing act. Yeah.
that balancing act. And I had a lot of catching up to do, because my last 4 years of high school were learning how to read. So I had to go to the 20 level class, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, up to the 100 level classes on learning basic history, learning. So I was basically doing high school again in my first years at community college. And it dawned on me, I could take classes. Like, once I got past the 60, the 20, 30, the under 100 level classes, I could take all my classes, even history, and learn about something that has to do with adoption.
Wow.
And so I was like, oh, maybe I could do this school thing. And then I started taking classes at community college to get my AA transfer degree, my 2-year AA transfer degree. And I was part of the I was a trio student. I was part of the disability services. I had all my books on tape. I had a note taker in every class. I had all the support that I probably needed back when I was younger to be successful in school. And then lo and behold, I was a straight A student. I busted my ass. I was really good at studying something that I liked to study, and I turned everything into adoption. Math,
Wow.
statistics, adoption. Go research that. History of adoption in the United States, Indian child welfare, MIPA, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act. This just like engrossing myself in educating myself about adoption. So I then transferred and went to a small private liberal arts school, 4-year school for my last 2 years. Uh, Again, straight A student. I went to that school, got an excellent scholarship. I filled a lot of boxes. I was an older, non-trad, non-traditional student. I had a learning disability. I checked the box of disabilities. I was a woman of color.
Yeah.
And I had really good grades. So I got an incredible scholarship to go to Willamette University, and I chose that school because I had a couple schools to choose from. I chose that school because I went to the sociology department and I said, I'll go to the school if you let me design my own program. I'll do all the things that I'm supposed to do to check the boxes to graduate with a BA, and I want to do it with a certificate of adoption. She's like, well, we don't have a certificate of adoption, but you can say that you specialize and you went to school with an emphasis on adoption. And I said, perfect, done. So she learned a lot along the way. She was incredible.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I figured out how to go get my master's degree in adoption without getting my master's degree.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And
Yeah.
then from there,
And
did
from
you
there,
launch?
no, from there I worked at at the Oregon Post Adoption Resource Center here in Oregon. And I worked there for 5 years. That was a program that supported families post-adoption. It was 100% post-adoption. That felt much better. In my school years, I had worked at different adoption agencies. That didn't feel right. I
Yeah.
realized I couldn't do that. So then the Oregon Post-Adoption Resource Center was hiring when I graduated, and I was a family support specialist providing support for families that had adopted through the child welfare. The problem was that we were not allowed to serve families that had adopted privately, private domestic or private international. And so at that point, I was taking calls and from families that were not eligible for our services, and my supervisor, Claudia Hutchinson, who was telling me at every staff meeting, Astrid, you got to stop taking these calls. We told you you can't take these calls. And I said, I that just isn't fair. You know that. I mean, come on. So we made an agreement. She allowed me to tap into the listserv during my off hours and use
Mm.
my private personal phone to start taking phone calls for families that weren't eligible, because we had this incredible database.
Yeah.
And so I felt like she met me halfway, considering she didn't want to lose her funding, her grants to do the work that we were doing, right? Um, so that's when I started Adoption Mosaic, because those calls and taking those calls off hours and in the evenings, I was starting to do that a lot. And there were a lot of people that were starting to hear about ORPARK. And then I met 3 women, 3 adoptive moms. And this was just the, grassroots kitchen table, started this organization, Adoption Mosaic. It was very centered around educating white adoptive okay, let's keep it real. White adoptive moms. There were almost never adoptive fathers.
Oh,
And
interesting.
it was almost, at the beginning, it was almost exclusively moms that were leading that. And so I was the face of the organization. We applied for our 501(c)(3. We got it. I was the one who was doing the training. They were behind the scenes. Well, we were supposed to be the fundraisers, and be the people who kept the organization legally and all all the filing and doing all of that.
All the things. Yep.
All the things, all the things. And I was supposed to just go out there in the world and keep doing what I was doing, which was creating resources for our community and educating our adoptive families, adoptive parents. And then we started doing some youth activity groups. And I realized, wow, working with kids is really powerful.
Mhm.
And that was really impactful. And we ran Adoption Mosaic. We started it in 2005, and uh and then in 2011 I found my birth mother.
Oh my goodness.
And and here I was running. I was the executive director at this point of Adoption Mosaic. I left the board, and then we hired me and one other person. uh and I left. So yeah, so I went and found, I didn't actually go and find her, but I've ended up finding our birth mother. And the rug was pulled out right from under me. Here I was supported. I was creating education. I had adoptees. I had access to adoptee therapists. I had everything that any adoptee who was going to go into a reunion, I would have said at that time needed to
Yeah.
have their support system around them. And yeah, I'm sure it was helpful, but in the moment, the rug was pulled out right from under me when I found out that my sister and I had been kidnapped and sold in the black market of adoption. And so this narrative that I grew up with, and this narrative
Mhm.
that I questioned because there were a lot of maybes and I don't knows when the story was told to us. Uh, and to find that out, I had this, I kind of lost my sense of self.
Yeah.
Uh, Found Carmenza, got a divorce, closed Adoption Mosaic, and got into an extremely unhealthy, abusive relationship. And everything just kind of came crumbling down, and we closed the organization. And that was in 2015. And uh and i i don't know why or how, but I had the wherewithal that I was still meant to do this work someday, when I figured this out, and when I kind of picked myself up, or found the support that I needed, or just healed through this thing that was making me have to question who my profession, who I was as a person, my family, who these parents were, that were, supposed to be these wonderful people who were supposed to care about me and love me and all of this,
Mhm.
and that they were part of this corrupt system, that this like that just it just really shattered my identity and the everything that I was doing in adoption. Like, in that moment, I
Yeah.
feel like there was, well, it wasn't a moment, but in that time period, I just knew I didn't want to do the work that I had been doing. It just wasn't right, until I figured some things out. So I did have the wherewithal to ask the board of directors as we were closing if I could have all the intellectual property. Of course, the bank account, when you're a nonprofit and you close, you
Mhm.
have to give all your
Yep.
money to another nonprofit. But uh, the board of directors were absolutely, has always been yours anyway, and yes, and so they handed over all the intellectual property for Adoption Mosaic. And I knew someday I would relaunch it in some capacity. I didn't know how. And then I did some healing. I did some intense therapy, figured out the divorce, got away from the toxic relationship. And then it was clear I wanted to rebuild Adoption Mosaic as an adoptee centered organization and business. I wanted to launch it as an LLC, running around like a chicken with my head cut off, trying to get 200, $20,000 grants that would last us a month to keep the
Yeah.
organization running, because that's what it costs to run this organization, right? And um, I then, towards the end of Adoption Mosaic 501(c)(3), we weren't funded. We couldn't find funding because the narrative of adoption was so screwed up in our society of the rainbows and unicorns. Everybody's like, why aren't you guys happy? Like, you adoptees, you're out here asking for money. Like, for you guys are the lucky ones. Why are you asking
Yeah.
for money for this organization? So we ran into that. So I knew I didn't want to run a 501(c)(3). I didn't want to chase grants. I just wanted to just do this work of supporting my adoptee community. And through that process, I realized that I actually wanted to work with families, parents,
Hmm.
adoptive parents, and I was good at it. I had done it for so many years of my career, and I had built some really strong relationships with people that would, again, like Dixie Davis, give me the platform and let me be the expert on adoption and just stop talking and listen. And those were the adoptive parents that I just felt really connected to and felt that I had something to offer them, and that there were so few adoptees that were creating programs that were talking about adoption in the way that
Yeah.
they needed to hear. So I did decide to continue working and educating, and we do at Adoption Mosaic. We still do that. And in fact, a lot of our adoptive parent program funds our adoptee programming. And that's
Yeah.
so
That's
it should be.
beautiful. Yeah. It's beautiful. First of all, thanks for just being so vulnerable and sharing this journey, this very hard. Uh, I'm sure it still brings up a lot of feelings for you when you talk about it because it was a life transformation for you in like multiple ways while also dealing with rediscovering who you are and what it means to you to be an adoptee in this space. And I'm just so appreciative that you had the wherewithal, right, to know that you're going to jump back into this space when you're ready and when you've come, out of the waters a little bit. And now Adoption Mosaic is stronger than ever. You're doing amazing things with all sorts of amazing people, both adoptees and non-adoptees and their families. And I really encourage everyone, if you're not already, to follow Astrid, follow their work. She has an incredible team. They are doing events and educational workshops constantly. So I will be sure to drop it in the network for everyone to know where to find you. But I do want to explore a little bit, with this 20 years of work, this 20 years of really being a leading voice in this community, what have you seen really shift in our society about adoption and the narratives that are being told?
That's a really hard question to answer because the narratives that are being told, I feel like not a whole lot has shifted. We are not baseline has not shifted, and that's really
Okay.
hard to say out loud. And when I say baseline, I feel like there's so few people who come into adoption with the question of, I should be questioning, what does an ethical adoption mean? Does that exist? Can it exist? What is that? What is taking a child away from? What does supporting a child who is somebody else's child? That
Mm-hmm.
kind of language, that is not the baseline way we talk about adoption, right?
Yeah.
It's still, you're taking a child and you're making them yours,
Yeah.
right? So what I will say is what I've noticed is in the adoptee community, the narrative has really shifted. And I don't know that I don't know that the narrative has shifted, but we've found each other The pandemic, I think, is the best thing that ever happened to our adoptee community. We found each other. We started listening to other perspectives. We started learning about how to talk about adoption beyond the narrative that we grew up talking about adoption, where we've got conferences out there that are more accessible than they ever have been because they were online for so many years. And so I think I'm seeing the biggest shift happen in our adoptee community.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm
Mhm.
really happy to hear that from you.
Mhm.
That gives me a lot of hope for the more, the progress that we as a collective can make together to continue pushing, right, the narrative and reframing it and changing the mindset and how we talk about and how we view, like you
Mhm.
said, ethical adoption. So, in our last minute or two, uh, your network at Adoption Mosaic, you serve people of all backgrounds, all professions, at all places in life, basically, that come to you wanting this educational support and community. And being an entrepreneur yourself, like you, you walk the walk. And I know that you're seeing and hearing a lot about how our lived experience is really impacting how we build our lives and how we build our careers too. And I'm curious, as a last question before we open it up for Q&A, what what would you like to see become the future of the workplace for people with lived experience? The future experience, I guess, of the workplace.
Mm. I think that it really comes down to how we own our own stories and where and how we are. We're all so different in the way we want to talk or not talk about adoption. And when I think about the workplace, I just had a conversation last night with a young man who said, we went to an event, an incredible event that was put on by the Constellation Reading here in Portland with Shannon Gibney. There were 5
Mm,
authors, Angela Tucker, Susan Ito, Sam, I
that's right.
forget. Yeah. And so, uh, and there was a young man who was really young, and he said, you know what, thing I'm the most worried about is I'm going to go to work tomorrow and somebody's going to ask me about what I did tonight, and I don't want to
Mm,
talk to them about it. I don't know what to do. And so I don't think there's one way to work in the workforce and be an adoptee other than you have your places where you do talk about how do I talk about my adoption, or where do I go to talk about my struggles of imposter syndrome? Or where do I go to get to talk about, I'm tired of being asked to to chair the DEI,
yeah,
whatever program committee for my corporation because there are no other people of color, and I was raised in white isolation, that I'm tired of that. So being in community with other, like this program, or being in community with organizations or programs that can help an adoptee have some language that is
yeah,
comfortable for them, because there's just not one formula.
yeah.
So
No,
being in community.
I think that's spot on. That's our vision too, and I'm glad we share that.
Yeah.
Astrid, it was great to have you. We're
Mm.
gonna open it up for Q&A, but for those watching the replay, thanks so much for joining. Thanks for tuning in. Catch Adoption Mosaic on all the social networks. So LinkedIn, Instagram, you name it, you can find them there. We'll be sure to drop the links in the comments. And it was a pleasure to have you and share this space with you. And thank you for being such an incredible
Mm.
movement maker and
Mm.
change maker and voice for our communities, Astrid. We really
Thank
appreciate you.
thank you so much. Ciao.